It was a typical summer afternoon at the local community pool until an encounter changed everything. A white woman confronted a young black teenager at the gate, questioning his right to be there. The exchange quickly escalated, drawing the attention of onlookers. As voices rose and tension filled the air, the scene unfolded like something out of a courtroom drama. But then the atmosphere shifted. A sleek black car arrived, its presence commanding immediate attention. When the door opened, the identity of the individual who stepped out sent shockwaves through the crowd, leaving everyone speechless. What happened next would not only redefine that day but also challenge perceptions in a way no one could have anticipated. Stay tuned to witness how this encounter takes a powerful turn. You won't want to miss it. Like this video, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification bell for more impactful stories. Jasmine Clayton was a 14-year-old who carried himself with quiet confidence. Thoughtful, respectful, and naturally athletic, he had an energy that drew others in. Jasmine had recently moved into the neighborhood with his mother, Governor Jasmine Clayton, a history-making leader known for her fairness and strong sense of justice. For Jasmine, the move represented more than just a new house. It was a chance to embrace the carefree joys of summer, make friends, and find his place in this new community. That day, as Jasmine approached the community pool with his swim gear in hand, he felt nothing but excitement. He wasn't just there to swim. He was there to enjoy the simple pleasures of being a teenager in a neighborhood that promised a fresh start. But his plans for a peaceful afternoon were about to take a turn, and not because of anything he could have foreseen. Standing nearby was Linda Harrington, a 50-something homeowner with a reputation that preceded her. To some, she was just another long-time resident who liked to keep an eye on the neighborhood. To others, she was an overbearing presence, quick to pass judgment on those she deemed out of place. Linda often took it upon herself to question and challenge those who didn't fit her narrow view of who belonged. When she saw Jasmine that day, she didn't hesitate to act on her assumptions. Around them, the pool hummed with the sounds of summer. Children laughed and splashed in the water, parents relaxed on lounge chairs, and the lifeguards sat perched at their stations, more focused on their phones than anything else. The initial exchange between Linda and Jasmine was subtle enough that many didn't notice at first. But as Linda's questions became sharper and more pointed, the dynamic began to shift. Bystanders started to glance over, their curiosity piqued, but no one stepped in to intervene. The scene might have looked like just another misunderstanding at first glance, but it was quickly becoming something far more significant. Jasmine, calm and composed, stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. Linda, unwavering in her position, pressed on, determined to assert her authority. What began as an ordinary afternoon was rapidly transforming into a moment that would test everyone present and reveal truths about this community they could no longer ignore. After school, Jasmine walked to the community pool, the sun casting a warm glow over the pristine water and neatly maintained grounds. This was his first visit, and he was excited to experience what he'd heard was one of the best spots in the neighborhood. The smell of chlorine in the air, the laughter of kids playing, and the rhythmic splashes of swimmers created a welcoming backdrop. Jasmine stepped through the gate with a towel over his shoulder and an eager smile. But no sooner had he entered than Linda Harrington noticed him. She was seated nearby, watching everything as she often did. Her eyes immediately fixated on Jasmine, her expression shifting. She didn't recognize him, and to Linda that was enough to raise suspicion. She stood and approached him with the kind of authority that demanded attention. Her tone was sharp, her posture stiff. "Excuse me, young man, who are you?" Jasmine turned, surprised but polite. "Oh, hi, ma'am. I'm Jasmine. I just moved here with my mom a few weeks ago." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Moved here? Where exactly? I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years and I've never seen you before." Calvin hesitated for a moment, trying to keep his composure. "We live just down the street, ma'am. I'm just here to swim." But Linda wasn't satisfied. Her tone grew more insistent. "I don't think so. This pool is for residents only. Do you have an ID? Proof that you live here?" Calvin blinked, confused by the sudden demand. "I didn't bring an ID, I just came to swim. I live on Pinewood Lane, if that helps." Linda folded her arms, her expression hardening. "Pinewood Lane? Well, if you live there, you should have no problem showing proof. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Around them, the usual hum of poolside activity began to quiet as people started to take notice. Some parents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. The lifeguards shifted nervously on their perch, clearly aware of the tension but reluctant to get involved. Calvin stood his ground, trying to remain calm. "Ma'am, I don't know what else to say. This is my neighborhood too. I just want to swim." But Linda wasn't backing down. Her voice grew louder, drawing even more attention. "If you live here, then prove it. Otherwise, you have no business being here. This is private property and we don't allow just anyone to walk in." Calvin glanced around, hoping someone might step in, but no one did. The lifeguards, still seated, looked as though they were weighing whether to intervene, but ultimately remained silent. The tension hung in the air, thick and unrelenting, as Linda continued her tirade. It wasn't just the words she was saying, it was the way she said them. Her tone carried an unspoken message, one that Calvin understood all too well. He felt his pulse quicken, but he refused to let her see his frustration. "I'm not here to cause trouble, ma'am," Calvin said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just here to enjoy the pool like everyone else." But Linda's response was immediate and dismissive. "Then show me you belong here. Otherwise, I'll have to get the management involved, or worse." At this, a murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered nearby. People whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Still, no one spoke up. No one took a stand. The scene had become something more than just a disagreement at a pool. It was now a public standoff, with Calvin standing alone against Linda's relentless questioning. And while he maintained his composure, the weight of the moment was unmistakable. As Linda's voice grew louder, so did the attention of everyone around the pool. Some onlookers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying their discomfort. Others sat silently, their expressions neutral, but their lack of action spoke volumes. In the midst of it all, Calvin stood alone, his calm demeanor now accompanied by a look of visible distress. He took a deep breath, trying once again to explain himself. "Ma'am, I don't know what more I can say. My mom and I moved here recently. I live just a few streets over." Linda wasn't having it. Her voice was sharp and cutting as she reached for her phone. "Enough. If you're not going to prove you live here, I'm calling security." "This pool isn't open to the public," Linda said firmly. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder as she dialed. Some people looked uncomfortable, fidgeting in their seats or whispering to those beside them. A few even seemed to silently agree with Linda, nodding along as if she were doing the neighborhood a favor. Others, however, looked uneasy, their faces marked with quiet disapproval, though none stepped forward to intervene. Calvin clenched his fists at his sides, his mind racing. He knew better than to raise his voice or show anger, even though he felt humiliated. He stayed calm, speaking evenly despite the growing tension. "You don't need to call anyone. I'm not trespassing. I live here." But Linda was already on the phone, speaking with exaggerated urgency. "Hello? Yes, this is Linda Harrington. I'm at the community pool, and there's an unauthorized person here. I think you'd better send someone down right away." The words hit Calvin like a wave. Unauthorized person. He glanced around, hoping someone might vouch for him, but the crowd remained silent. The lifeguard, still perched on their high chair, looked down nervously but didn't say a word. Minutes later, 2 security guards arrived. They walked briskly through the gates, their presence commanding attention. One of them, a tall man with a clipboard in hand, approached Calvin with an air of authority. "We've had a report of someone trespassing," he said, his tone firm. "Can you tell us your name and why you're here?" Calvin took a deep breath, steadying himself. "My name is Jasmine Clayton. I live in this neighborhood. I'm just here to swim." The guard raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at Linda, who stood nearby with her arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. "Do you have proof of residency? An ID? A pool pass?" the guard asked. Calvin shook his head. "I didn't bring anything. I just came here straight after school. I live on Pinewood Lane with my mom." The second guard, shorter and stockier, chimed in. "Without proof, we can't verify that you belong here. Do you have anyone who can confirm your residency?" Calvin nodded quickly. "I can call my mom. She's at work right now, but—" Linda interrupted before he could finish. "Oh, please," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "If he lived here, he wouldn't have such a hard time proving it." The first guard hesitated, looking between Linda and Calvin. The young teenager's distress was evident, but the guard seemed reluctant to go against the confident certainty in Linda's voice. Calvin felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The whispers among the bystanders grew louder, with a few voices murmuring things he couldn't quite make out. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling slightly, and began texting his mom. He wasn't sure what else to do. The message was short. "Mom, can you come to the pool? There's a problem." The seconds that followed felt like hours. Linda watched him with a satisfied smirk, her arms still crossed, as if daring him to find a way out of this. The guards continued their questioning, their tone less accusatory but still pressing. "Without proof," the taller guard said finally, "we may have to ask you to leave until this can be sorted out." Calvin opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, something shifted in the atmosphere. A sleek black luxury car pulled up just outside the pool area, its polished exterior gleaming in the sunlight. The sound of the car door opening cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. Everyone turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the sudden arrival. Calvin froze, his phone still in his hand. He knew that car. He knew exactly who was stepping out, and in that moment, the tension at the pool reached its breaking point. The car door opened, and Governor Jasmine Clayton stepped out, her presence drawing every gaze in the pool area. Dressed impeccably in her work attire, she moved with a quiet authority that instantly shifted the atmosphere. Her expression was calm but determined, and the click of her heels on the pavement was the only sound as she approached the pool deck. The security guards straightened up immediately, recognizing her. Some of the bystanders, who had remained silent until now, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Linda Harrington, who moments ago exuded confidence, took an uneasy step back, her smug demeanor faltering. Governor Clayton stopped just a few feet from the group, her gaze moving deliberately from the security guards to Linda before settling on her son. She placed a reassuring hand on Calvin's shoulder before addressing the gathering. Her voice was measured and calm, but carried an unmistakable weight. "What seems to be the problem here, and why is my son being treated like a criminal?" Linda's face went pale, her composure cracking under the governor's sharp, unwavering gaze. She opened her mouth to respond but stumbled over her words. I didn't know he was your son. I was just trying to make sure everything was in order here." Governor Clayton raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "In order?" she repeated, her tone cutting through Linda's stammering like a blade. "And what exactly gave you the authority to interrogate a teenager at a public pool? My son is a resident of this neighborhood. He has every right to be here without being harassed." The taller security guard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Governor Clayton's eyes remained locked on Linda as the guard struggled to find words. "We were just responding to a call. There was a concern about—" She turned her attention to the guards, her voice still calm but growing sharper. "A concern about what, exactly? A teenager swimming in his community pool? Did you ask for his side of the story, or did you assume that the call alone justified your actions?" The guards exchanged nervous glances, neither of them willing to answer directly. Linda, now visibly trembling, attempted to regain some of her footing. "I didn't mean any harm," she said quickly, her words tumbling out. "I just didn't recognize him, and I thought—" "You thought what?" Governor Clayton interrupted, her voice now carrying an unmistakable edge. "That he didn't belong here because you didn't recognize him. That his presence required proof while everyone else's didn't." She gestured to the other pool-goers, who were now watching silently, many avoiding eye contact. Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Governor Clayton turned back to the security guards. "I'd like to remind you both that this pool is governed by the same laws that apply everywhere else in this state. That includes laws against discrimination. My son is a resident here, and he deserves the same respect and freedom to enjoy this facility as anyone else. Do I make myself clear?" Both guards nodded quickly, muttering affirmations. "Yes, ma'am." "Of course, Governor." She then looked directly at Linda, her expression softening slightly, but her tone still firm. "And as for you, Ms. What is it?" "Miss Harrington," Linda replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd suggest taking some time to reflect on why you felt the need to escalate this situation the way you did," Governor Clayton continued. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot less like concern and a lot more like bias." Linda looked as though she wanted to disappear, her face flushed, and her hands fidgeting nervously. She nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact. Satisfied, Governor Clayton turned back to her son, placing a comforting arm around his shoulders. Her voice softened as she addressed him. "You okay, Calvin?" Calvin nodded, the tension in his face easing as he leaned into his mother's reassurance. "Yeah, Mom. I'm fine now." The crowd remained silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. As Governor Clayton turned to leave with her son, the quiet authority of her presence had not only resolved the conflict, but left an indelible mark on everyone present. As Governor Clayton and Calvin began to walk away, the silence around the pool was broken by the hesitant voice of one of the security guards. "Governor Clayton," he said, stepping forward, his face etched with regret. "I want to apologize. We handled this poorly, and I'm sorry for the distress caused to your son. We should have listened and approached this differently." The second guard nodded in agreement, his voice subdued. "We'll review our protocols to make sure something like this doesn't happen again," one of the guards said. Governor Clayton paused, her gaze steady but calm. "Apologies are a start," she said, her tone firm yet constructive. "But what matters more is action. Take this as an opportunity to reflect and improve, not just today, but every day moving forward." As the guards nodded, visibly humbled, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. A parent seated by the pool spoke up, their voice tinged with guilt. "I should have stepped in earlier. I saw what was happening, but I didn't say anything. I'm sorry, Calvin." Another bystander chimed in. "This isn't right. No one should have to go through that to enjoy a day at the pool." The murmurs grew louder, shifting into a collective expression of disapproval aimed at Linda Harrington, who stood awkwardly off to the side, her face flushed with embarrassment. She fidgeted with her bag, avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. Without a word, Linda turned and began gathering her things. Her shoulders slumped as she hurriedly left the pool area, the disapproving stares and whispers following her. The crowd, once silent, had now found its voice. The lifeguard, who had remained on the sidelines throughout the incident, climbed down from their chair and approached Calvin and the governor. Their face was a mix of regret and determination. "I should have said something sooner," the lifeguard admitted, their voice heavy with guilt. "This is on me too. I promise I'll make sure no one else ever has to go through something like this again. I'll report this and push for better training for everyone here." Governor Clayton nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Acknowledging the issue is the first step. But understand, this isn't just about policies. It's about people. It's about recognizing our own biases and having the courage to speak up when we see something wrong." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had silenced Linda moments before. "This is a teachable moment for all of us. Discrimination, whether overt or subtle, has no place here or anywhere else. It's not enough to avoid doing harm. We have a responsibility to actively stand against injustice when we see it. Silence enables these situations to happen. Action prevents them." The bystanders, many of whom now looked visibly moved, nodded in agreement. A few even clapped softly, the sound growing as others joined in. Calvin stood quietly by his mother's side, the initial distress on his face replaced by a quiet pride. As they walked away from the pool, the energy in the air had shifted. What began as a moment of confrontation had turned into an opportunity for reflection and change. While the day had been far from what Calvin had hoped for, he left with the assurance that he wasn't alone, and that his mother's strength and the awakening of the community had turned a painful experience into a step towards something better. Calvin and his mother walked side by side as they exited the pool area, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Calvin held his head high, his shoulders no longer weighed down by the tension of the ordeal. His mother's reassuring presence beside him seemed to say everything he needed to hear, that he was seen, heard, and protected. As they reached their car, Governor Clayton placed a hand on Calvin's shoulder and looked at him with a quiet smile. "You handled yourself with dignity today," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." Calvin nodded, his smile beginning to form. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." They shared a brief moment of silence, the weight of the day easing just slightly. Calvin opened the car door and climbed in, glancing back at the pool one last time. It was no longer a place of unease, but a reminder of his resilience and his mother's unwavering support. This incident reminds us all of the importance of standing against injustice and ensuring equality in our communities. As the car drove away, the message was clear. Even in moments of hardship, there is strength to be found in unity and in the fight for what is right. If you believe in stories that inspire change and stand against injustice, like this video, share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe, comment, and click on the notification bell for more impactful stories.